UAP, unidentified anomalous phenomenon. Are they extraterrestrial, interdimensional, time travelers in origin, or are they simply a result of top-secret military projects, false flag alien invasion, PSYOP, drones, or other human-made aircraft? Join the discussion now on UAP Crossfire.
Welcome, everybody, to UAP Crossfire, where four alpha males discuss ufology and try to give you the real deal of what's going on in ufology today. And before we introduce the panel, I just want to do some quick shout-outs. First, I want to say to the New York MUFON group, congratulations. You are the chapter of the year. You won a great prize. I really want you to understand that you did such a great job, and I can't be any more prouder of all you field investigators out there and stuff. And also to Tommy Nesser, who won one of these as the field investigator of the year. Out of almost, I think, over 800 field investigators, he was number one out of New York. So Tommy and team, thank you very much. Second, I just want to say, hey, the silverback of ufology himself is going to have a birthday, and I want to wish him a happy birthday. I'm not going to sing him happy birthday.
Happy birthday.
Right down there. Happy birthday to the one and only Don Ecker. It's great to have him still around.
Happy birthday.
Hey, did he just flip a finger at us?
No,
steal that tape back.
Nice to have me still around.
He just gave you the bird, Don. The producer of the show just gave you the bird. I can't believe it.
But also, Chris, I got to say that's a sharp shirt. That's all.
Oh, I was going to say, that was the next thing I was going to say. I want to say thank you to Commander Cobra for providing these UFO shirts.
Oh.
I asked me up some. I told my wife I was going to wear this at the police barbecue. She says you better wear a bulletproof vest under it. So I just hope you got it a little bigger.
I
so
got
can
one too, and like a dummy, I had totally forgot to put it on.
What are we supposed to wear today?
Yes. Thank you, and what can I say?
Yeah, it's a great shirt. I didn't realize I was supposed to wear it today. I didn't know today was the day.
I got to tell you something. My wife told me, she says, Chris, I hope the thing shrinks, so I'm going to use it as a dust rag. But I love it. I'm going to wear it, and we'll see what happens. Anyways, let's introduce everybody here. I want to start, of course, with the silverback of ufology. He's the man who's done it all himself, Don Eckert. Hello, Don.
Good evening, sir.
And stuff. And the pilot who's been in the skies more than anybody else. He's a great pilot, great historian. He knows what he's talking about, so you better listen to him. Commander Cobra. Hello, Commander.
Hey, you know how you can tell a pilot? You know how you can tell a pilot?
What's that?
He's always talking with his hands, right?
Yeah. Well,
you know how you tell a really good one? He lights the wristwatch on fire when he's telling the story.
Oh. And our local great scientist, I mean, he's done it all himself. You see him on television, you see him on the radio, see him on podcasts.
I don't usually see him on radio. I hear him on the radio.
Oh, I hear him on radio. I see him on radio. Who gives a damn? This is just a podcast.
I hear him on the TV and I see him on the radio. Got it.
Okay. If this was NBC, you could
I want
chew
what
me
he's
out.
smoking.
And stuff.
It's the shirt. It's the shirt.
It's the shirt. It's got me really, really up there. So, gang, I'm telling you, tonight's topic is going to be the Nazis, the Vril, and UFOs. And so I just want to go once around before we start showing photos and videos and everything else. What do you think of the Nazis and the propulsion systems that they had with ufology? Let's start with Mark.
You know, I believe it or not, I had closely followed developments at Peenemünde in Germany, which is where the V2 was developed under Wernher von Braun. And I thought many times there have to be secret projects that they've been working on there, and I just was never sure of what they were, what it could be. But in tonight's topic, I have a feeling we're going to delve into the possibilities of what they were doing alternatively besides making rockets to rain down destruction on London.
Well, they were very creative, Mark, with their, propulsion systems. They took science and they said, "This is not the science we want to do. This is the science we want to do." And they were very advanced. Some people
Yeah,
say
they were doing a lot of experiments with heavy water, which you don't need for the rocket fuel. I don't think they were using for rocket fuel, but that's still something to consider what they were doing with heavy water. I think they were looking at nuclear science early on, but couldn't get very far, thankfully.
Well, weren't they working on kind of propulsion systems back in 1929? I mean, there was talk about interplanetary travel back in 1929, I believe.
Sure, but it was all more hypothetical with machinery that had yet to be invented. But still, we had ourselves developed nuclear rockets, right? I'm sure Commander knows about that, and Don probably knows about that over there. Okay, we've made nuclear rockets in the past, but they were very dirty. They would actually spew radioactivity, and the Cash Lundgren case might be an example, for instance, where two folks were exposed to a radioactive rocket gone awry or system gone awry at that point. And I don't know for sure, but I think that in the Cash Lundgren case, it was a radioactive test flight.
Well, we know they dug up the road. They know that there were radiation burns on the people that were in the car. And, obviously they wanted to get rid of the evidence on the Cash Lundgren case. But, it was a system where, it was more dangerous to have that than anything else. So, Don, I want to go to you now. The Nazis, the Rills, Hitler, and UFOs.
Well, there have been all kinds of rumors, mythology, some actual factual events that have been discovered. But when I think about all of that, I think about one thing primarily, and that is Wernher von Braun. Okay. Now, at the end of the war, our intelligence people and military scooped up every Nazi scientist they could find. They did it before the Russians could get their hands on them. And they brought them over here secretly. This was all in secret. Now, the majority of these guys were down and out war criminals. Wernher von Braun, whom basically ended up designing our Saturn V rocket that got us to the moon, had his ass kissed regularly at NASA. Okay. And I've often wondered how many people, Americans especially, were aware that von Braun had been an ardent Nazi SS colonel at Peenemünde. Okay. Using slave labor, Jews and other subhumans, what the Nazis deemed to be subhumans. And how many of those people died under von Braun? Never a mention of it. Now, my attitude was and is that those guys should have been brought over here, should have been tried, okay, if found guilty, squeeze them for every bit of knowledge they had, and then hung them. But my wife says sometimes I'm a reactionary. Von Braun definitely, I think, should have been executed, but he wasn't. And then, as time moved along, and he kind of slid a bit into the UFO field, and there was a woman out there, I believe she was a doctor, a PhD, by the name of Carol Rosen, who was an ardent von Braun fangirl. Okay. And she went around for the longest time claiming that von Braun had told her that we can't militarize space because what they'll want to do is put weapons in space, and that's bad, and that's just a recipe for disaster. Okay. And I wondered if she knew, if that woman, because she happened to be Jewish or is Jewish, if she knew this guy was a Nazi. And then what? Okay. So, I can't get past. Look, my old man was one of the GIs that ended up at Dachau at the end of the war. They saw the aftermath, and he would barely even mention it, talk about it. They saw the piles of hundreds and thousands of bodies laying in boxcars and out in the field, rotting away. What the Nazis, the SS, did to these poor people, and I just can't get past that, guys. And I of course wasn't alive then, but it's something that stuck with me.
Don, here's one of the questions I want to ask you. Why were the Nazis so successful in putting rockets into space on the outer brink of space, yet they were very unsuccessful in the beginning here in the United States?
That's an excellent question.
And nobody's been able to answer that question.
I'll give you a good stab at it.
I'm going to come to you. I'm going to come to you right now, Commander, because you're the pilot of the season.
So we'll get to your question. Let me work backwards. So when you talk Nazis, UFOs, up into probably the last couple years when this subject came up, I pretty much dismissed it because the area that this always centered on when I had discussions was ETs had made contacts with the Nazis. There was some kind of an exchange of technology. And this is how the Nazis almost won World War II. And I don't prescribe to that. I don't prescribe that occurred because I have a simple factor I come down to. Why'd they lose? If they had that advanced technology, well, how could they have possibly lose? Now, the next tier when you enter into that discussion is, did they recover some technology? Did they recover something from a crash and then started working in engineering?
Well, you're right, Commander, because there was a crash in 1936, supposedly in the Black Forest of Germany.
So that has some possibilities. In the particular case on the rockets and why we had trouble, when we put Operation Paperclip, which is the kind of the Band-Aid that's placed over the acquisition of technology and the scientists and engineers that were pioneering these breakthroughs that the Nazis were producing. Half of them ended up in Russia and half of them ended up in the United States. And it's pretty much a pretty even split between the technology. That's part of the reason why you weren't able to see these fantastic things kick out very quickly. Also, they weren't putting people into space. They weren't putting large numbers of or large payloads into space. They were putting warheads, and they were looking for the ballistic missile capability. The ultimate goal of the Nazis' rocket program was to produce the V3, which was to strike the United States.
Okay, but here's my question to you, because I'm not a rocket scientist.
Nor am I. I did date one once, but that's a story for a different night.
Okay.
You sure?
I'd kind of like to hear it now, actually.
All right, birthday boy, relax.
My question, I almost forgot my question. Anyways, my question to you is, they were very successul putting payloads into space because the V2 was still...
No, they did not put payloads into space. They did not achieve orbital flight.
Isn't that a weapon or an explosive payload?
Yes, but they did not achieve orbit.
They didn't go above the Kármán line.
They were suborbital.
Okay, right, but I mean they hit the outer area of space. Am I correct on that?
Yes.
Okay, so if you hit the outer area of space, wouldn't that be considered space?
Yes, but you're saying orbital. They did not put things into orbit.
Oh no, I'm not saying orbit. I'm sorry. I apologize for that. I'm saying they were very successful with putting explosives.
It depends on what you want to say is very successful. 200 V2s fired to get 2 that work doesn't sound super successful. When you have the outstanding setup program that they did, slave labor, and if you really want to get down to some, those slaves were considered to be in a better situation. When they died, the Nazis allowed rats to eat the dead, and then the rats were caught and fed to the other slaves. That was their main protein source, to keep track of the work schedule and to keep people functioning until they couldn't function anymore. So if you want to look at success, it's possible to say success, but they also had large problems with things like gyros. They could not get their gyros because of the encroachment by the Allies on both sides. They could not get the materials they needed to perfect gyros, so they could not get their rockets to fly and accurately go. We saw a repeat of this in Desert Storm with Scuds. The Scuds did not have very good guidance systems, and they didn't follow anything like GPS guidance. They were still using the same basic gyro system to get it to the target. That's why you heard so many people squawking about when they would fire a rocket and our news media would go out and say, well, this rocket just landed here. They'd go out and adjust the next one by adjusting the fins to get it a little bit closer to where they wanted to hit.
Gotcha.
We
Mark, you
helped them
wanted to jump in on this. Go ahead.
Yeah, I made a mistake. I said the V2s didn't cross the Kármán line, which actually they did.
Yep.
They were the first ones to do that. And the Kármán line is defined as the gateway to space. You go above it and you are technically in space, and that's 50 to 60 miles up. So they did cross that. But as far as the technology, as Commander just mentioned, it was very primitive, and more V2s failed than worked. And the idea was that if only a few were to land, that would strike fear into the hearts of the London population, and make them feel like they're vulnerable, they could be struck, and that was really the whole point. Remember the buzz bombs,
The V1.
Yeah, the V1, right? Prior to V2.
Using a very simple ramjet.
A ramjet, that's right. In fact, I know people that have made radio-controlled ones.
Yep.
And they fly them, and they just go, and when they stop, that's it. They're gliders. And in the case of the V1, as everybody knows, they would run out and go, and when you heard that stop, that's when all the eyes were up looking for this thing coming down. Because if you heard
Mark,
it stop,
would you consider the V1 a primitive drone?
No, it'd be more of a cruise missile.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Because it was an air breather. It didn't go into orbit. And the same gyro technology that was being used was the same type that was used in airplanes.
Gotcha. Yeah, and they could actually tip them if they could fly next to them fast enough with like a Spitfire. They could tip the
Spitfires and Mosquitoes, and they would actually just build the lift underneath the wing. They didn't actually have to hit them. They would just build it, and then they would topple the lift change would topple the gyro, and then at that point it would flip over.
No, that's very cool.
Right. Now let me just, Chris, before you go, a couple other things. Foo Fighters. A lot of people want to say that was the Nazis that had the technology that is responsible for Foo Fighters. Other people have postulated that Foo Fighters were ET observers that were in the middle of this activity. Obviously, we've talked about the jets, but I think one area that does get short drift, and I think it gets covered over in a lot of the other, I'm not going to say romantic. There's nothing romantic about the Nazi business at all. But in the enthusiasm to discuss these breakthroughs, we've turned them into a kind of had super stuff. No, they didn't. Not the stuff that we've seen. The question you opened up before, why do we have so much trouble? Because we were replicating the same work that they had done in World War II through the 50s. And when you started to put on bigger payloads and had not developed the technology, it actually paid off for us in a very interesting way. You were slowly building. And since we weren't using slave labor and we weren't allowing people to to just use up humans to produce it. It went in a much slower pace. One interesting thing, the group of scientists that the Russians grabbed really were on the large scale rocket. And that's why they developed very large scale rockets and very large payloads. We didn't get that group. And that's where von Braun comes up with the idea of using multiple stages, which is how we got to the moon and is still a very popular way of getting payloads in. But we still couldn't put big payloads into space. So it forced us to figure out how to miniaturize. And that miniaturization and the development of transistor, which comes out very close to this period of space exploration, is what accelerated why we're talking on computers tonight and why we made so many breakthroughs, because we could not put large payloads into space.
Well, the other thing that mattered at that point was the diameter of the rocket was limited because of the power delivered versus the fuel consumption.
Right, the thrust.
Size.
Right, the thrust to your payload, right?
Yeah, and the diameter of the rocket body itself was limited to just a few tens of inches, okay, back then. And we needed something 5-6 times that diameter in order to get into orbit.
Well, let me slip down a side street here from where we're talking. During the 60s, during the height of the space race with the Soviet Union to get to the moon, the Soviets built some rockets that basically dwarfed what we had. Did they, in your opinion, did they over-engineer those ships? And is that why they failed so spectacularly?
I think because they don't have the same, or did not have the same social constraints, they just kept scaling up. They have, you're talking about unlimited resources in comparison to the rest of the world. The Soviet Union could have buried the world if they had ever applied the kind of work that they were doing to build their military. If they were building cars and wash machines, they would have, but they didn't build those things. They were building tanks by the multiple thousands every year, airplanes by the multiple thousands. And they are a quantity versus quality kind of crowd in there, because they figured if they could overwhelm, then they would be able to take over where these advances are being made. Also, there's a high amount of espionage that goes on. Why even worry about it when you can just steal it from somebody else?
Right, like the
kind of like
shuttle.
what the communist Chinese are doing. I mean,
Like
we used to joke about it all the time. Oh, that airplane looks like an American C-130. This one looks like an American C-141.
Right, and the Russian Buran space shuttle looked like our space shuttle. It was a stolen project.
Isn't that amazing? So the Saturn V, Mark, how many stages was the Saturn V rocket?
It was
still a 2-stage or 3-stage?
It actually had, well, okay, there were different kinds, okay? They had one to go to like Skylab, and then they had one to go to the moon. Those had different numbers of stages in them, okay? You had the first stage, the second stage, and the third stage, which was like the cruise stage, cruise, C-R-U-I-S-E, which would take you to the moon. To go to Skylab, though, it was a short stack, okay? It was a shorter stacked rocket. You had a first stage and a second stage, and I don't believe they had anything else beyond that, because they actually maneuvered to the Skylab with that. So that was a big rocket. If you ever had a chance to stand behind the Saturn V down at Kennedy Space Center, Cape Canaveral, or go to the
Huntsville,
or
Huntsville,
that's right, thank you, or you go to the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum, they have one of the Saturn V engines in there, an engine bell. And these things are massive, and they deliver thousands of pounds of thrust each. Okay, and again, the diameter of the engine nozzle was like the limit of the size of rockets in the past. Okay, Robert Goddard's rocket was literally about maybe 18 inches in diameter when he first launched. That rocket, I think, was launched from Roswell, wasn't it?
Well, he did some out of Worcester, Mass, and then he course, then there was the stuff that
But there's a
White
museum in
Sands and
Roswell.
Roswell.
Yeah, there's a museum in Roswell that has his rocket gantry out in the front. You know.
Now, Commander, you brought up something, and I'm going to switch the subject a little bit here. You brought up Foo Fighters, and everybody talks about the Foo Fighters in World War II. We saw them. The Germans claimed they saw them and everything. Some people actually thought that was German technology. I don't go to that theory. I don't think it was, because I although they were very advanced. So before I get your comments, I want to play this video clip.
Indications are the Nazis were ahead of all of the Allied nations in terms of technology. First-hand accounts tell us that from as early as the 20s and 30s, their technology far outstripped anything else on the planet.
Further evidence for highly advanced Nazi flying craft came in the form of the so-called Foo Fighters. They were unexplained balls of extremely fast-moving light that started buzzing Allied aircraft over Germany. They were first reported in November 1944, towards the end of the war, and were sometimes seen as single balls of light streaking across the sky in front of Allied aircraft. And sometimes there were many of them flying off, around, and under the wings.
There were reports from our airmen, and strangely enough, from the Luftwaffe flyers later on, about these mysterious Foo Fighters, which were faster and which had better armory and which caused a lot of damage. The whole thing was hushed up for many years, but it looks as though the German designers and developers had produced several experimental machines which were generally called Foo Fighters.
Some pilots described them as resembling Christmas tree lights and reported that they seemed to toy with the aircraft, making wild turns before simply vanishing. Pilots and aircrew reported that the objects flew in formation with their aircraft and behaved as if under intelligent control, as they could never be outmaneuvered or shot down. The phenomenon was so widespread that the military took the sightings seriously, suspecting that the mysterious objects might be secret German weapons.
It would appear as though the Nazis built advanced, technologically superior flying machines for purposes of military supremacy. However, their radical design led them to be interpreted as being of extraterrestrial origins.
The fact that the Foo Fighters appeared at the time when the Nazis were experimenting with this kind of craft is enormously suggestive that the Foo Fighters were actually the German craft, perhaps remote controlled. I wouldn't say it's proof positive, because it depends what you think of all the other UFO reports that have come out since then. If they're extraterrestrial craft, they could have been buzzing around then. But it's certainly suggestive, and it certainly ties in with the idea that these were actually kind of Nazi secret aircraft.
So you hear two different things. Some people say it was Nazi secret weapons. I don't go by that theory, but I want to start with Commander. Commander, Foo Fighters.
So it falls into two categories in my mind. One is these are extraterrestrials that are observing and are not picking winners or losers, and they're in the middle of this. Or, yes, they created some kind of advanced technology, but they could not harness it to do very much offensively. I disagree with one of the gentlemen that was speaking in there. I believe he had a collar on. It looked like he was a minister, that they wreaked all kinds of damage. No, they didn't. They did not wreak all kinds of damage. Me-262 caused a lot of damage. The Me-163, the rocket plane, that caused a lot of damage to bomber flows.
Wait, you meant the 262?
Say again?
The 262, you mean?
Yeah, it's the jet, and then the Comet, the 163, was their rocket plane.
Okay.
That took off with Stoff 1 and Stoff 2, hydrogen peroxide and oxygen, highly corrosive, killed a number of fueling people. It did not have, it had a little carriage for wheels. It launched. It was so fast They developed two gun systems for it. One was a cannon that had shot out of the aircraft, and the other one was an automatic quad cannon that they would fly under the bomber stream, and when the shadow went over the top, it would automatically fire up into the bombers. They weren't able to perfect it. All those aircraft ended up with Britain, France, the United States, and the Soviet Union. But back to your question, Foo Fighters. It does give me kind of a feeling of Tic Tac when I hear.
I was going to bring that up. I was going to say, if you.
Oh, that's because you and I are wearing the same clothes, man. We're simpatico. These other two, they're correcting me on, how many buttons I did on my shirt tonight. So,
I certainly was not.
We're going to get a son of a bitch out of Don Eckert tonight. You watch and see. Them sons of bitch.
All right, there's another one I want to throw into you on there.
Brewing over
People
there.
don't realize this.
Yeah.
They created the Wunderwolf, the Wonder Weapons that they were under. Yep. They created an airplane mainly made out of plywood that was near supersonic. They were running out of metals. They were running out of supplies, and they were producing airplanes made of wood that were approaching the speed of sound. And the theory on that one was you would fly up, you would launch vertically, you didn't need a runway. It was a rocket plane. It would fly up into the bomber stream. It would shoot these rockets off. And the way it would come down is the pilot cockpit section would break away and parachute, and then a parachute would open for the fuselage. But because it was wood surrounding the metal to make the rocket engines, and they could move them around and launch them vertically and didn't need a runway, pretty intensive smarts there going on that to try to stem the tide of being basically bombed into the Stone Age.
Absolutely. Don, Foo Fighters.
This is something that I've always been fascinated by. And incidentally, they were not only seen in Europe, they were also seen in the Pacific Theater of Operations. Okay, the Japanese saw them and we saw them over there. So this kind of gives it like a worldwide phenomenon. And I kind of come down on the side that somebody was observing this big dust up that was going down on the planet below. And then in 1945, in July the 26th, when we basically set off our first nuke, and then August 6th, when we dropped our first nuke, that's when things got very interesting. So I kind of come down on the side that they, in fact, may have been extraterrestrial device of some kind. Now, you're right. There's really no anything to suggest that these things damaged aircraft, but there were a number of reports when these things would swarm in on an aircraft. They did suffer some malfunction in the multi-engine bombers, some kind of effect that screwed up the engines until they flew away. I'm sure you guys have heard that, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. So would you say that Foo Fighters are the same thing as today's orbs?
Well, no, I'm going to say no, because when I hear orbs and I hear the supernatural kind of it, they're much smaller. I haven't heard anybody talking about an orb up next to their airplane in a long time.
Well, they talk about orbs in space. I mean, they call you see orange orbs or red orbs. I mean, blue orbs. And I'm not talking about the supernatural. I'm talking about, that these things are like crafts.
Well, I'm not necessarily going to say that there's a separation. I'm not one of those folks that says you can't have a pew in all the churches. I think that there's a hell of a lot more crossover we want to give benefit on.
Well, we'll get into demonology. I think.
Well, here's one other thing. We are focusing tonight on World War II and the Nazis.
Yeah.
During World War I, aviators talked about Foo Fighters in World War I. There are encounters of German pursuit pilots in World War I shooting at UFOs. So if we are now at a technological level and we're being observed, and you have the ability to buzz in and buzz out to see what's going on, to take a look at what the natives are up to on the little blue planet, it does kind of fit to me.
Now, my grandfather was a World War I veteran. And when I was a kid, a small youngster, I was fascinated by that. And I used to ask him all kinds of questions. I'll never forget one time he told me that during the First World War, the Germans had developed, now, of course, this was extraordinarily primitive technology compared to what we have today, but they had radio-controlled aircraft. This is what he told me. Now, was I there? Did I see it? No. But knowing my granddad, I kind of presumed he knew what he was talking about. But there was some other oddities that cropped up during the war, World War I. And one of them was something called Lady Sopwith. Are you guys familiar, or have you ever heard anything about that, Lady Sopwith?
I think I have done.
I mean, Sopwith camels and aircraft. That's all I know.
Right.
Yeah. Well, according to, and I have some information because at the time I discovered this, I was fascinated by it. There were pilots, male pilots, British, American, perhaps the French, that encountered some contemporary styled aircraft, biplanes, that were being flown, this is the story, by some extraordinarily beautiful women. And these aircraft had no national identity on them, but one case where this British pilot was flying along on a mission of some type, he kind of was feeling a little odd. He turned around and he looked behind him, and here was this biplane right on his tail, flying up with this beautiful blonde female as the pilot. And later she dove away and supposedly attacked some German aircraft. Now, I mean, hey, that sounds too weird by far, but there were more than one or two stories about that. So, in wartime, weird things happen. I know from my own experiences in Vietnam, weird things occasionally pop to the surface. So what do you do with something like that? I put it in my gray basket.
So I'm glad you put it in the gray basket. It is an interesting part. There's also a lot of tangible things that happened in World War I that we don't talk about. Now, you're correct about breakthroughs in radio technology. They were really getting to the point of using wireless by tapping Morse code to throw information out.
It was pulse technology.
The most important thing that airplanes did in World War I on the front was not fight each other, was to perform reconnaissance to tell the people on the ground where the enemy was, so they could figure out when they were going to go out of the trenches and what they were going to do next. By far, the vast majority of aviation on that. Stealth finds its first desire in World War I. They took and doped as clear as possible airplanes, so that the airplane was see-through, except for, of course, the ribs, the wooden ribs of the airplane. They were referred to as the skeleton airplanes. It just didn't work out that well. But there's this story of these ghost airplanes that were flying around, generally at dusk or at dawn, that did not have, the normal doped painted canvas skins, these clear sheet type material. And you could see the ghost pilot in the ghost skeleton airplane. That's where that came from. There were French airplanes, captured German airplanes that could change. They could change their rondelle in flight. So they would take off with the French rondelle. They would pull levers, and they would bring out the iron cross of the Germans, and fly in this German airplane over the German lines, getting intel or going after other airplanes, and then come back by a certain route at a certain time that was arranged. Now, those things are not well known. You have to really dig deep. They're not even well recorded in that. So
I have no idea about. I never heard of the skeleton planes before. That's interesting.
they experimented by putting lights on airplanes next, trying to get the lights to match the background lights so that you would not pick the airplane up. Obviously, this is before radar, and everything's on visual at this point. But even during something like Vietnam, they had airplanes in the Q program that were quiet. They had huge, long exhausts and mufflers that made the sound of this thing less than a scooter. I happened to have flown with a guy who actually was part of that program. People could not see him when he went over at night at 1,000 feet because they could not hear it.
Wow.
Amazing.
And it was a glider-type airplane.
Mark, I want to get to you. You haven't had a chance to talk about Foo Fighters yet.
Oh, I don't mind. I'm listening. This is fun.
Yeah.
But yeah, I tend to think that, based on the fact that they've been in the Pacific Theater, seen in World War I, seen in World War II, to me, it means that we may be under observation. And I have no doubt, nor should we doubt, that a technology visiting us is going to be very highly advanced. And if they're highly advanced, then they're going to have probes. I don't think these are crewed vehicles, CREWED. Okay, they are actually drones of a type that we can only dream of. And maybe their mechanism of operation is to be a sphere, which allows them to go in any direction and suffer the same relative consequences no matter which direction they're going. Okay, because they're a sphere. They don't have to worry about going into the wind or whatever because they're a sphere. And if they're traveling using a different methodology, I tend to think it's interdimensional, as does a lot of other people actually in science.
Why do you base your theory interdimensional, Mark? That's very fascinating.
Oh, well, see, we're in 4 dimensions, X, Y, and Z moving through time. Okay, and if you think about everything we've done, everything we've been doing, everywhere we've been in the planet, in the solar system, and beyond, we can say that now. It's all been done within the 4 dimensions. Okay, so within the 4 dimensions, we have rules we have to follow. One of the rules is you cannot go faster than 186,282 miles per second. Okay, which is the speed of light. Okay, that's the speed limit in our 4 dimensions. Well, if there was a way to sidestep that, then you would want to do that. One way we've heard of is the warp drive, which is very popular. In 1994 on, Miguel Alcubierre came up with this drive that would actually be able to warp space around the ship, okay, create a thing called a warp bubble. And so it would actually pull distances toward you, and then you would just go a short distance between where you were and where you're going to, and then undo the warp bubble, and now you've gone that much distance. Okay, so if you do that multiple times, you can get to, say, Alpha Centauri, and the current rate of speed we can travel in the universe right now is maybe about 30,000 miles an hour or so with our satellites. Event Horizon was, I think, the Pluto satellite that went about as fast as that we could go. And still it would take more than 10,000 years to get to Alpha Centauri at that speed, at the fastest possible speed we can go. But if you can warp space, you can reduce that down to 5 days. Okay, sounds great, except that the energy requirements, the energy budget is so steep to actually achieve that warp that it's just a thought problem, and everybody acknowledges it's difficult. So there's another possibility, and right now it's being looked at over at the Large Hadron Collider, and it is possibility of using another dimensional aspect of travel, and that is not the 4 dimensions anymore, but the 5th dimension. Now that 5th dimension is interesting because if you could get yourself in there somehow, you will find that the universe is really warped. And that means that the farther in you go, the smaller the universe becomes around you, right? There's a few other caveats within that, but that just confuses things. The thing that's most important is that let's say you travel 1 foot in our 4 dimensions, you travel 1 foot. If you can shift into this 5th dimension and travel 1 foot, if you go a little ways in, when you come out, you might have traveled 2 feet. Okay. If you go a long way in, that same 1 foot might translate to the distance from here to Pluto. And that would be just one singular shift. So the bottom line there is that we see the possibility, we collectively, meaning CERN, Large Hadron Collider, physicists, Avi Loeb now, and others, that possibly we can use this 5th dimension to travel. And what would you need to do? Well, you need to create these particles that you can surround your ship with. Okay? And we'll talk about the creation in a second. So you create these particles, you surround your ship with these particular particles, and they have a name. They're particles theorized by these 2 physicists named Kaluza and Klein, right? So they're called Kaluza-Klein particles.
Now, how did they come up with that? That must have been a hell of a long meeting.
They were German scientists, wasn't it, Mark? He was a German scientist.
I don't know about Kaluza and Klein's history, but
are they like the PIM particles?
The what particle?
The PIM particles?
Oh, I thought you said pimp.
I thought
PIM, PIM.
Yeah, no, I don't.
The PIM particles, the after-hours show.
PIM, I guess you guys never watched an Ant-Man movie, huh?
No, but Mark, there was a German scientist called Theodor Franz Edward Kaluza, and he actually was a German mathematician.
1920s, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, he's the guy.
And Kaluza-Klein theory, which involved field equations in 5-dimensional space-time, and his idea that functional forces can be unified by introducing additional dimensions, were reused much later for string theory. Now, I don't know what that means, but it sounds pretty important.
I can tell you. Okay. And you're jumping ahead a little bit, but that's fine because, those are all valid points to look at. If you consider what Kaluza-Klein particles are, they're gravitons. Okay, they're the elusive particle that we can't find yet. If you look at our fundamental forces, we have the strong force, the weak force, we have electromagnetic force, and we have gravity. These 3, the first 3 I mentioned, well, those start and end here in our 4 dimensions. We can see them. We can work with them. We can calculate them, bend them, refract them. Okay, we can write equations to manage all of them, and we can consider all of them particles. We have a wave of light. We have a particle of light called a photon. Okay, we have an electron, which is a particle, and we have a wave equation that we can use, a probability function that we can describe an electron with. Gravity was the weirdo. Okay. In gravity, we didn't know if we could see gravitational waves. Einstein said we may never. Okay, but we did see gravitational waves using a observatory called LIGO, and we have one in Hanford, Washington, one in Louisiana, and then there's a counterpart in Italy called Virgo, and they saw these waves of gravity. Now, what does that even mean? Waves of gravity pass through the Earth. 2 black holes collided. And because the gravity is so powerful, when they collided, they disrupted ripples, like ripples in a pond. They disrupted the space. Now, I won't get into space-time, but that an understanding of space-time is why you can have ripples in what we think has nothing in it. Okay, because it's not empty; it's a fabric, as we've talked about many, many times. So, if you see these ripples come through the Earth, you now see gravitational waves, and now we know they exist. They do, but we're missing that other thing, that gravitational particle, the graviton. Kaluza and Klein theorized that there is a graviton, and the Kaluza-Klein hypothesis, it's in Wikipedia. You can go and look it all up and see stuff. My friend Bob Schroeder wrote a book called Solving the UFO Enigma, in which he tackles this head on, and he describes in a way that I'm on board. I'm 100% with this guy. I think he's a very, very smart man. Okay. Yep. And he came up with the process by which the Kaluza-Klein particles could be used in order to undertake interstellar travel. But he's not the only one. Okay. Kaluza and Klein felt they were very interesting particles, and CERN thinks they're very interesting particles. They actually added a detector, which they've got results for now online. You can look up. The detector is called ATLAS, ATLAS. And ATLAS has been looking for Kaluza-Klein interactions to see if the theoretical particle exists. And lo and behold, this particle is the key to interstellar travel, because if you can generate that particle, we talked about how with the strong, weak, and electromagnetic forces, those wave and particle duality that's going on there, that all starts and stops in our 4 dimensions. It's that 5th dimension where gravity lives. That's where the graviton is. So it originates here but ends there. Think of it this way. So that means that we'll never see it looking in our 4 dimensions. We have to look outside, and we can see clues that it exists, and that's what the Atlas detector at CERN did. And so now it's no longer just science fiction. It's a possibility. But there's one more thing. Okay. How do you make these particles in your ship?
I was going to ask that.
Yeah, I read your mind. Those particles are made using a particle accelerator. And have you ever noticed UFOs seem to be round and circular? There's a reason. They're particle accelerators. And they're generating the particles. And these particles come out and pull the ship into the 5th dimension. They're generating Kaluza-Klein gravitons. And when they do that, they're pulled automatically into the 5th dimension from where they reside, from where those things come. And so when they go in, if they make more of them, more intensity, they go farther into this 5th dimension. And when they come out, they can travel further. So when people look in the sky and they see a craft going like this, and then all of a sudden it does that, whoa, it moves so fast. Nothing could survive that kind of turn. Absolutely correct. And neither can they. Okay? They're not actually moving. They're not turning. All that changes for them is the scenery outside their windows, because they're punching out of our 4 dimensions, going into the 5th, and then punching back in at a new entry point over and over and over, tens, hundreds, thousands of times a second, depending on the frequency that they're using. So in other words, when you watch something underwater or you see something in the sky moving at unbelievable speeds and not even breaking the sound barrier, that's because it's not moving. You're seeing it just pop into the 4 dimensions here, then it's gone, then it pops in here, then it's gone, then it pops in here. Now just imagine if all those pop-in points were very close together. Your eye would see something going zoom across the sky very fast. A submarine would see something going through the sonar very fast, right? But it wouldn't have any of the effects of ocean depth, the weight of the ocean on the craft, or air affecting the craft. Or
the very gravity.
Yes,
and if you're doing that, you have your own gravitational field established.
That's right. In fact, it's through the massive use of gravitational fields that they may very well travel. And guess what that does? It allows them, when they use these Kaluza-Klein gravitons surrounding their ship, the gravitons do several things. Number one, they take in a little bit of the light, okay, that might be coming to your eye to see it when you're seeing something in the sky using this. They may take in a few molecules of the atmosphere. The thing is, these gravitons are 10 to the 17th, that's very strong, 10 to the 17th times more powerful than the gravitons holding us all to our chairs, okay? And what that does is several things. It makes micro black holes. Micro black holes last for a few nanoseconds at best, okay? And every black hole evaporates. It's just a matter of time. For micro black holes, they're in and they're out. So if you keep supplying them around your ship, several things happen there. Those Kaluza-Klein gravitons, which make the micro black holes, pull the ship into the 5th dimension, all right? And then when it comes back out, punch in, punch out mechanism, it'll be traveling through the area that you see in the sky, if that's where they go. They're probably the best cartographers in the universe. They know all the entry points back in to our 4 dimensions. So as this thing is doing that and generating these particles, all right, the particle accelerator inside is generating the particles, feeding them out through the outside of the craft in the theory. And thus the craft itself is doing something very important. These micro black holes are not allowing the Earth gravitons to reach it, anti-gravity, by simply eating the gravitons from the Earth, all right? And that's what these KK gravitons do. And to our human eyes, watching something like that move in our skies, what would we see? It might look like it's shimmering and changing colors. We've heard reports of that. It might look like it's moving across the sky and changing directions very rapidly. We've had reports like that. Okay. It might look like it's blinking and doing all kinds of strange stuff. And we've had reports like that. We've had reports of it just vanishing out of sight, being gone in a split
And Mark,
second.
the same thing going to happen to electro-optical and IR mechanical devices that are looking at them as well.
That is correct. That is correct. That's why our technology within our 4 dimensions is not adequate to capture the full process being undertaken by these things. That's why we only have fuzzy photos. That's why we don't have anyone that can say this definitively, yes, they're here. But here's the thing: when they go to land, they have to turn off that process, and the reason is because there are particle accelerators, and when you try to accelerate particles in a circle, okay, what do you get? You get synchrotron radiation coming out in all directions. Synchrotron radiation will kill you, all right, in high dosages. How many times have we heard of people approaching a craft and getting burned?
Losing
Synchrotron
teeth,
burns.
losing hair.
Synchrotron burns.
Right.
Okay, so you see, this stuff it all matches. This stuff all matches.
Sure does.
Mark, is that the same as ionized radiation or electromagnetic radiation?
Synchrotron radiation is radiation from spiraling radiation caused by particles that are being forced in a circle with a strong magnetic field. So that radiation is still going to do severe damage to your body and wreak havoc on you. I think in the Cash Lundgren case, it's possible that they encountered a nuclear-powered aircraft and they got hit with basically the nuclear exhaust.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a strong possibility. However, there's other people that actually had imprints on their bodies of these exhaust vents on a UFO when they got too close, and those are radiation burns. You know, thermal and radiation burns, and so synchrotron radiation would cause that too. So,
Mark, I'm going to hold it right there. We got to go
no
through a break, but we're going to come back and finish that.
How long are we
Stay
going
with
to
us
be?
right after this commercial. We are back with UAP Crossfire with Don Ecker, Mark D'Antonio, and Commander Cobra. We've been talking about stuff that's way above my head, Mark. So why don't you just finish up there, and then we'll go to the next subject.
No worries. And the bottom line is this, okay? All the effects we see of UFOs in the sky, the shimmering, the outright vanishing, the right angle turns, all of these can be explained. As an astronomer, I can explain all of the effects. Atmospheric scintillation, the autokinetic effect, and something at the edge of visibility. But what we can't do is deny the possibility that we're looking at Kaluza-Klein gravitons being used by a craft.
And that was actually started to be developed in the 1920s, late 1920s.
Yeah, Kaluza and Klein came up with that operational theory back then.
Yep.
And just like Miguel Alcubierre, when in the 1994, it was just a thought problem back then. I will say though that Sonny White at EagleWorks Labs worked on the shape of the spacecraft Taurus that would generate this warp bubble for the Alcubierre drive, and he found a way to have it use 10 to the 24th less mass to generate the warp bubble.
Now you're starting to get to attainable numbers now.
Exactly. You go from the size, you go from needing the mass of Jupiter converted to energy, which is stupendous. If you remember E equals mc squared, that's called the energy equivalence. If you take the mass of Jupiter times the speed of light squared, that's the energy you need to make a warp bubble, a single warp bubble. But you're going to need a few of those. So that was colossally impossible. But when they reworked it to do it only and gain a 10 to the 24th gain, reduction in the mass required. Now you're talking about something the mass of the Voyager spacecraft converted to energy. Much lower number.
I have a question talking about this. It's mind-blowing. It's stupendous. But in my lifetime and your lifetimes, okay, have you ever considered the geometrical leaps in technology that we have achieved? It's beyond comprehension.
Absolutely.
My grandfather's older sister, all right, my great aunt. I'll never forget about 1961 or 62. One of my great uncles had just died, and we had gone down to the family homestead to do some work and gather some of this guy's stuff up. And my great aunt was there, and I was all enthused about the space program. President Kennedy talking about going to the moon and all of these incredible things. Now remember, this would have been 61, 62, 1962. And she looked at me and she said, you know, those rocket ships are going to cause us a lot of problems. Now, I didn't know what the hell she was talking about. Okay, I didn't understand her thinking. But we went literally from our rockets blowing up on the pads to landing on the moon by the end of the decade, 69, July. As a matter of fact, we just passed a few days ago.
Anniversary of my first solo flight, 10 years after the landing on the moon.
Yeah.
My love of computers started in the early 70s, and one of the magazines I used to get had a computer kit that, well, you had to be technical to put this thing together. And then you didn't have a program to run it. All right. But that was the start of it all. And now we're looking at something like this, which would have blown the computer on the Apollo 11 craft that went to the moon to smithereens. There's more computing power in this new cell phone of mine than all the computers back then. I mean, it's just amazing. Now, my point is, how did we do that as quickly as we did? If you look at just 100 years ago, we were barely coming out of horse and buggy. We had the first gasoline engine, internal combustion engine putt-putts running around. And now, well, it's beyond belief. Do you think maybe we had some help somewhere along the line? Commander?
Well, yes, I think it's a very strong possibility of technology transfer, technology exploitation. I also think there's a very prevalent theory that's proven out that given the opportunity, mankind will collapse these time schedules down. The technology continues to increase. What's the one, Mark, that they talk about that every 10 years you basically have reduced the time cycle for the technology breakthrough? That's why we've gone from transistors down to now bubble gas memory that's being used. We're now floating information inside almost to we're approaching the atomic level, what we're able to do for the computing power. And the power requirements have gone down.
Organic memory soon as
right.
well.
Thank you. That's the other part I was driving towards. So there are some theories, some rules that explain this kind of stuff. A couple of things are happening. Wars are excellent for combining technology. If we did not have the Civil War, we would not enjoy the medicine that we enjoy today. The Civil War, because we were running out of people, they were trying to figure out how they could treat people quickly enough, as well as to keep the masses calm on both sides. But the Union Army really was the one that was pioneering this. We also used rail, especially the Union Army during that war. That was maneuver warfare before it started. Those two things have what led to things like using helicopters on the battlefield, using reconnaissance. The Civil War was the first place that we used aerial reconnaissance, balloons. They were wired with telegraph keys. They didn't have the radio technology, and both sides were tapping it down to say where the bad guys were. It changed the course of battles because when they saw a balloon up, they started firing at the balloon. They can't hit the balloon, but the rounds, the artillery lands on where the enemy's at. That gets the enemy upset. they get on their feet and they start running into the battle. It was changing how things went. But we learned how to complete. Now, today, the buzzword, it's not even a buzzword anymore. It's just accepted. We're networked. Everything is networked. So you have an airplane like the F-35, which may not be the hottest dogfighter ever to fly. I would not want to go up against it. That aircraft, that pilot, and the technology that's in it, which dwarfs anything that we're holding in our hands or how we're talking, is able to activate weapon systems on the other side of the globe while it's flying. It can interpret information, and it can lead to a missile being fired because it picks it up and it's integrated into that battlefield. That's where we're at. That's why I think we're very close to perfecting some of the things that the Nazis may have broken up. To me, the one that's always going to have my interest is the anti-gravity drives. And I believe the things that they were playing with, as crude as they were achieving anti-gravity flight. And I put that in quotation marks, anti-gravity displacement. But I think the amount of energy and the lack of the ability to control it is what led those things not to go very far.
All right, well, let's take a look at that, Commander. I got a video I like to show everybody, and then we can discuss the Glock.
And tell me more about the bell. The bell was a device which was in the shape of the bell, but it was a kind of accelerator. There were two drums or cylinders inside, which were spinning during an experiment at opposite direction with very high speeds. And it was something that was emitting very harmful radiations of various kinds. And the bell was tested underground in special underground chambers, probably as the one that we can see here. It was a device 4 or 5 meters tall, so it would take a significant portion of such a hole.
And so these are top secret experiments that the Nazis are carrying out in these tunnels?
Yes, these experiments were so top secret that the entire facility where it has been tested has been blocked.
Fundamentally, the Die Glocke, or the bell, was full of certain deadly radioactive materials in order to make it do what they were hoping it would do. And a number of the top scientists and technologists who were working on it in the experimental stage died of radiation poisoning. It was, in a double sense, a potentially deadly weapon.
According to plans discovered at the end of the war, the bell was actually the propulsion device for a powerful vertical takeoff craft, which had 2 large discs rotating inside a cylindrical outer shell. It was these discs, powered by a huge energy force, possibly radioactive, that gave the craft its vertical lift. Whether it was a flying craft or just a flying bomb, we don't know.
I'm going to start with Commander, you started this subject, and then you could see that the things that video was showing exactly what Mark was talking about: radiation and everything else is dangerous as a weapon. So, anti-gravity. You think the Germans were working on that? And
I think they cracked. I think they cracked quite a bit of it. I think the reason that it hasn't gone further isn't, and I think may recently have made some very strong advances, is that they lacked the technology to control what they were doing. So they're using very crude systems to achieve this. It's sort of the same thing that we were talking earlier about with the Russians. They were able to crack the size of the rocket motor that they were able to produce. So they were able to put their payloads into space. That's why we're the first to, put the orbital. Sputnik, friend, goes into orbit. Didn't do very much, except made everyone outside of the Soviet Union lose their minds. So you're looking at what I think, when you have no morals, you have nothing holding you back, you have nearly unlimited access to manpower to do this. And they did have a large swath of this planet under their control for raw materials until that was slowly being taken away from them. They were also strongly motivated to figure out how to get away from petroleum-based products because they did not have easy access to it. So they were looking for a power source. The United States was looking for that same power source. The people in the United States that were most interested in atomic weren't the people making the bombs. It was naval architecture. They were trying to figure out how, if you can bunker this much energy in a small space on a ship and not have to put fuel in it and make it go for years. Very interested, because now you can put in more people, more weapons, and you don't have to ever go into a port to get fuel or refuel at sea.
That's Hyman Rickover's. That was Hyman Rickover.
And Hyman Rickover, who propelled us into our nuclear navy, especially on the submariner side. To answer your question, yes, I think that they had broke it. Interesting too. There's another bell that they talk about. It's not the one you saw in there. The one that is very doesn't show up as much as it used to, and I'd say in the early 2000s in the documentaries. Looks like a Liberty Bell space capsule. It has that very classic bottom shroud rounded area, and it comes up into a cone shape. And that is very interesting when you think about what did we put into space? What did our capsules look like? I'm not saying there's a one-for-one relationship, but I'm saying you look at the shape and you look at where they were going. It seems to me that it's probably a lot less of a coincidence when you drive into those kinds of physical shapes.
You're talking about something like this, are you?
Correct,
yes.
Mark?
That's exactly what I was thinking too. That guy right there is what this Die Glocke was. But the images that were in the video you showed weren't this at all. It showed some kind of UFO with three things on the bottom.
Right, and Mark, there are now more pictures and more drawings now than I've ever seen in the last 10 years that have come out about that vehicle that they show, where they physically have mounted large 30 millimeter cannons at the top of that device.
They actually mounted them on disc shape too. There's some pictures in here that we can show. Don, the Glock, anti-gravity.
Well, couple of things about that. Number one, my now unfortunately deceased buddy Richard Saraday lived up in Tahunga, and there were some old German immigrants that had moved over here after the war that the guy had developed in Germany during the war some highly advanced optics and cameras, which of course the Nazis appropriated into their war machine. But he was the guy that originally told Richard about this alleged UFO crash that happened in the Black Forest. We talked about that years ago. Now, he knew about Der Glocke. And when Richard had mentioned it to him, the guy was shocked. He didn't know that it had become basically public knowledge. Now, the SS general that had been in charge of that program was a guy by the name of Kammler, who mysteriously disappeared at the end of the war. Everybody claims they have no idea what happened to him. And prior to him absconding, he had a massive effort. They were working on this device, which they found the spot, which was in Poland, where they were testing this. And according to stuff that I've read and people that I've heard talk about it, when they were testing this device, they had it basically grounded using chains, big steel, heavy chains that this thing couldn't take off and, I guess, get away from them. Now, at the end of the war, the Russians were coming in, the Allies were overrunning Germany. Kammler had all the scientists and the slave labor at this camp, which they were housing incidentally underground, shot. They were all murdered. So
Yeah,
nobody
he
can talk
killed
about it.
everybody.
Yes, killed everybody. Now, did we get our hands on them? I have no idea. Did the Russians get him? I have no idea. The guy just disappeared from history, but he was highly sought after. So, do I think that they were on to something? Yeah, I definitely do. And whether it was a result of help that Oberth talked about or back engineering from this purported crash in the Black Forest, I don't know, but I don't think it was totally terrestrial.
One
Mark.
quick thing I want to throw in there, John, when you talk about the craft being chained down, that is how first helicopter pilots learned how to fly helicopters.
Really?
Because they would literally have people hold the craft. There would be 6, 7, 8 engineers holding onto the craft, and the pilot would slowly lift it up into the air to learn how to make the movements, very gentle movements, to figure out how it flew. They kind of understood. So that kind of description readily fits because no one's actually flown something like this before. You can theorize. Nowadays, we can create simulators for almost any kind of flight environment we want, and you can go through and you can practice. You can even do emergencies. You can create emergencies. So when you hear something like that and it's chained down, and then, to keep it in there, you're putting, to me, someone like me, a degree of realistic approach that really makes you say, ping, something hits the middle there.
Mark.
Yes, sir.
Anti-gravity in the Glock. Myth, or you think they did it?
I mean, obviously, without knowing what's really going on and just hearing stories, you have to assume some of it's embellished, but there's always a potential nugget of truth in everything. So, like this, so maybe there's a nugget of truth in this, but don't know that we'll ever see it, publicly. It may be known to some, but I think that if they did it, it could have been something accidental that they happened upon, kind of like, and then they tried to make it accidentally on purpose to work, and it didn't, or it was very difficult to manage, so they had to abandon it because the war was dragging on, and they had other things to worry about.
Well,
so
we do know they were working on a project called Kronos. There was a project Kronos that's been confirmed, and that project Kronos was, I think, basically looking at different types of propulsion systems and possibly anti-gravity. Have you heard of Project Kronos?
I have not investigated Kronos. I know the name. I've heard it exists, but I've never done. I'm sure he knows about it though.
Yeah, I've heard it, but again, one thing I do want to throw into this. One thing, especially about the Nazis, but everybody was pretty good at this, is propaganda. So if you have a bench test of something and it's successful, there's people down the road who get told what this is, and they're creating cartoon models of it. They're creating posters of it. They're creating stories about it, and it's going out. There's a lot of reasons that you do that. You do that to upset your enemy. You do that to keep your people happy, that you're making advances. The so-called super race, they were completely hung up on this. But remember, this is also a time where things like radio and the breakthrough of mass communication at that level, at a near global level, that you could put the word out. That's all behind this, driving this. So when we see extensive reports or documents or pictures or engineering diagrams, I can show you pictures of the space plane down to sizes piece that this aircraft was going to fly. There are whole programs set up by Lockheed, McDonnell Douglas when they were still in business, showing these craft before the plug got pulled and someone says it's too expensive. Look at the NGAD fighter. Now all of a sudden we're not going to build it.
Tell us about the NGAD fighter.
That's
Cobra,
the next
'cause I've
generation
never
air
heard of it.
defense fighter. It's a 6th generation fighter. We have flown at least one, possibly 2 or 3 prototypes. That's been talked about in the open press. Again, nothing, no inside scoop. Not the project I work. I'm more unplugging toilets in the project I work. That's the end. That's the end of the aerospace world that I'm in right now. Is trying to get that stuff to work. But the new breakout technology. Now, 2 things are happening there. This is Commander Cobra's take on it. One is you don't want your adversary to be dumping lots and lots of money into their program or spending lots of time more these days breaking into your performing espionage and taking your technology. You purposely say you're not doing well to slow the other guy down. We did that in the 60s with terrain following radar. We actually falsified test results. People lost their careers. People got crapped on because we didn't want the Russians to think that we had gotten as far as we did, then Soviets, on terrain following radar, because they had created this incredible air defense system. And in the days that we were doing it, we were flying as fast as we could, 1-2 times the speed of sound, and trying to do it 500 feet or less above the ground. So that when we were seen on radar and they were going to shoot a missile or engage a gun, we were going so fast. To get that, to keep that edge, and we had an edge in it, and to throw them off, we had people come out. People lost contracts. It was all orchestrated to allow us to continue to have the edge. Same thing happened with stealth. They wrapped up stealth so much. But when stealth flew in Desert Storm, the Soviet Union folded. Between that and Star Wars, which Reagan had started, those 2 events collapsed them. It was over. We had come up with a cloaking device to use the Star Trek Romulan cloaking device, and it worked. And then, of course, we had to be Americans. We're telling you which window or which chimney we want to drop the round, and we're dropping the bomb into that window or that chimney. Okay, that's how good the technology got. Completely rewrote everything. It's not so much. We've moved into another area.
Well,
but
we had
the propaganda side cannot be thrown out of this.
We had the Brilliant Pebbles program too, Star Wars,
Right, and we say that all that went away, right, Mark? Because we didn't get anything out of that.
Yeah,
wasted a whole bunch of money. Nothing to see here. It's all done. Don't worry about it.
Well, look, it reminds me of that program I worked on here in my shop. I was doing a program called the Project Cormorant. Now it was under classification at the time. It went public. And now if you look it up on Wikipedia.
There's pictures all over the place.
Yeah. It's really malevolent looking, right? But if you actually go on Wikipedia and look about it, it says it was canceled. Sure it was. All that means is that different agencies paying for it now.
And it changed its name. And instead of winding it to the left, you wind it to the right now. Oh, it's a completely different program. Completely different.
That's right. But we see that all the time. Submarine programs. Oh my gosh! You guys know that I work in the Navy arena in the submarine world. Okay, commander's in the air. I'm under the water. Okay, but the bottom line is that, and I get seasick too, so it doesn't really work too well. But yeah. So, but
you didn't get seasick on the sub, did you?
I did actually, because for the first hour and a half, 2 hours, you're rocking and rolling on the surface. You don't dive. Yeah. You dive, it feels like this. But when you're in the surface, oh my gosh, I was going to throw up. And I had to have dinner with the captain later, because that's what you do when you're a VIP guest. And it was so important that when I asked what was going on, they basically said, basically keep my mouth shut, shut up and go back to being sick in the corner, But again, that was the trip, by the way, where we had that USO, that very fast moving object, move through the sonar. And when I asked about it, he said, "You having a good trip?" I said, "Yes, sir." He says, "Let's keep it that way." And
Mark, when you mentioned Brilliant Pebbles,
yeah,
when you mentioned Brilliant Pebbles, I am convinced that was the technology used to take a shot at that bogey on STS-48.
Well, it sort of looks that way, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Now I think I analyzed the STS-48 footage for at the time. I think it might have been What on Earth. It might have been Discovery Channel's NASA's Unexplained Files. I'm not sure. I don't remember. But I knew also that the shuttle's RCS, reaction control system, at the time, when they would fire the RCS and the shuttle would back away from where it was, they would tend to leave a ring of ice particles from the nose of the shuttle, because it's like Pigpen and Charlie Brown. It always is shedding ice.
Right.
You know, and that's from all the ice it acquired on the way up into space. And the ice is going to persist for a long, long time, sometimes the duration of the mission. So, you know, it was always shedding around it all the time. There's always particles flying in front of the windows all the time. And that's debris brought up from the Earth, you know. So I'm not sure whether it was that we're looking at, these concentric rings of particles, or not, you know. But the Brilliant Pebbles program, well, I know the guy that developed it with his team, actually, and you all do too, I think. I'll mention it later. But the bottom line is that he said that the program was developed, and I said, "Oh, but it was canceled, right?" And he went like this to me. That look, and that look like. So whether it was canceled or not, I don't know. But the bottom line is,
Mark, can a program be canceled by the government but yet picked up by a private corporation?
yes.
Let me put my fingers together like this.
Yes. Let's talk about that.
Yeah,
as a matter of fact, that project I was just telling you about, okay, Lockheed ended up with that project. That's public. It was a Lockheed project.
Okay.
Chris, a lot of things that are rules and laws and decisions are obstacles, not barriers.
That's right.
Yeah.
There are things that we do publicly in the budget that cover things that we will never know are in the budget.
That's right. You know, and just like we hear, it's like stop signs are only a suggestion, you know, right?
Yeah. Well, because you could see very similar patterns in some ways. The Nazi technology was tried to be kept quiet.
Well, since we're on the subject, Chris, let's talk about this.
What?
Well, Operation Paperclip, grabbing the scientists, grabbing the technology, grabbing the engineering prowess, acquiring this, being able to take those leaps. There's a very strong body of evidence and theories out there that say the same Nazi capabilities of government entered our government, entered the governments of Europe and the Soviet Union under this operation. You said you want to talk about that satanic part of it. I think these chaps were pretty close to that satanic part, especially when you look at some of the
all right, you're going to have to explain that then, Commander.
All right. There are still reports that are still classified that they will not release easily to the public, if they even exist anymore, if it hasn't been destroyed, of what the ceremonies and the paganistic religion that Nazism in its highest form had achieved. There's castles where these weddings took place, where these this was the absolute inner ring of the Nazi party. This isn't the running around with the hand up in the air, Heil Hitler stuff. This is the transformative level that they went to. And when this stuff was found, it was so troubling, it actually made people who had been at Dachau and other concentration camps go, that was not the worst thing I saw. And this has been completely scrubbed. My belief is that many of the people that were involved in that, many of the stuff that was there, infiltrated in these programs and came to the world governments. And I believe it has direct connection with demonic, satanic type activities.
All right, let me just show you this. And because, Hitler was very much into the occult. Hitler and Himmler were they were very big in the Buddhist and Hindu religion. As a matter of fact, they totally believed in something called the Vimana. I might be pronouncing it wrong, but it was the text describing flying machines from the Hindu and Buddhist religion.
Vimana?
Vimana?
The demonic,
Vimana.
And it's
Vimana.
Basically, it's the extension of flying carpets and the ability for people to lift themselves up by thought.
Right. And what Hitler believed was that the Hindu and Buddhist religion had a nuclear war years ago, and they actually thought that by them trying to discover this type of texts, the scrolls and texts from the India, whatever you want to call it, they could master this technology and take over the human race, basically, is what they were trying to do. So there is some credibility to what you're saying as far as, the occult being part of some governments, because like I say, Himmler was into it. They had a castle that they built for it that all not high-level Nazi propaganda people had to go to. They literally had to go for classes on this to be indoctrinated into this. Now, Don, you look like you got something to say. Well, I guess you don't because you're muted.
You're muted. Birthday boy, you're muted.
You're muted, Mike.
How about that? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now,
buddy? When you come close to the screen, we hear you.
Yeah.
No,
I totally agree with you. They were very deeply in the occult. As a matter of fact, in the 30s, via Hitler through Himmler, sent archaeological expeditions all over the globe looking for ancient artifacts and ancient, everything from the spear of Longinus to, the spirit, about the spear of destiny, right?
Right.
To all types of arcane mythological items, all right? And what they were attempting to do at the time, and it sounds crazy today, maybe not so much, but they were trying to harness the power that they believed the ancients had tapped into, going back as far as that goes to the mythological city of Atlantis.
Right.
So yeah, it's which they believe, incidentally, were originally the Aryans, the Aryan race, the original Aryans, came from Atlantis. So they were plugged into that stuff.
They actually called it the Vril, Don. I believe it was called the Vril Society. Mark, I want to get to you, but before I do with this, I want to get a video and get your opinion of it.
Then you're familiar with Nazi Germans running all over the world looking for artifacts and relics from which they could summon a spiritual power. And we have the records. There's no doubt that they did that. And there was one organization that began at the beginning of the 20th century that the Germans were fascinated with. It was the Vril Society, a kind of a mystical organization that claimed that it could channel the beginnings of the Aryan race, not from someplace here on Earth, but from extraterrestrials.
The German Vril Society is a society interested in what the Vril is. Vril is a notion of a superpower going beyond atomic power, something that has the ability to do all kinds of fantastic things, including those attributed to UFOs. At the end of World War I, where Germany was in abject defeat, it was of interest to German militarists as a possible source of power. The mediums in the Vril Society were saying that this force could be used to power craft.
There were mediums that were doing exactly what?
Okay. Generally speaking, mediumship is thought of in terms of communication with the dead. There's another group of mediums who channel material that is related to extraterrestrial or ultra-terrestrial beings, and it claims that it comes from the science of these beings, and that
if we adapt that science, we will learn a great deal about higher technology than we have. Of course, the Nazis, being interested in power, quickly bought into that, and the more desperate the war became, the more they wanted to do aircraft in tune with these mediums who were transmitting this material.
Mark, your opinion of the Vril Society?
No doubt that it existed, but I think throughout history, things again get embellished and exaggerated. I'm not sure how much of that's actually true. I don't think any of us know how much actually, it's all true.
Well, we do know that Hitler did send people out to get artifacts.
Yeah. I don't doubt that at all.
And he was very big in the occult.
Keep in mind that also Nazi society didn't believe in worshiping any god but Nazi society.
Right.
And so anything to do with acquiring artifacts and owning them is one way to put a kibosh on religion everywhere. If you own,
well, it's very interesting that they had a presence. They sent a presence down to Antarctica, and we all have heard stories about Antarctica. Now, whether those stories have any basis in fact or not, I don't know. But allegedly, some of the stories involve a civilization beneath the ice. And if we talk about that, then we've got to talk about Admiral Richard Byrd and Operation High Jump that went down there with troops, after the war was over, around 46. And they were scheduled to be down there for a couple of years, and they were back within 6 months, and allegedly they had their ass kicked. Now, who kicked their ass? Was it a Nazi German presence, or was it something else? I know you guys have heard these stories, and it's something that's never been really addressed in any great depth.
But it's like Mark said, a lot of these stories can be embellished. I mean, I've heard also people say that Operation High Jump was nothing. He went there, he lost a few people, but he came back and nothing really happened.
Well,
and
I've been to Antarctica 3 times. I had a close family member that was one of the sailors that was at High Jump. No battles. Didn't see any battles. If we got our asses kicked, how do we go back? Not an easy place to operate.
No,
Buzz Aldrin, when he was there, said this is what being on the moon was like.
Well,
this is what I envision Mars must be like.
Yeah, the dry valleys of Antarctica are a great
They're
place
amazing.
to train
They're
for
absolutely
Mars.
amazing.
He also said he saw something extraordinarily evil down there. Now, what the hell was he talking about?
I'd love to know. Now, I mean, there were 3 bars at the base I was at, and I did see some things happen there that were a little bit questionable.
Yeah, you got to think what's evil to him. What's evil to him nowadays might be something we just accept as ordinary.
Okay, then what would be your theory of why Hitler would send people to Antarctica?
Because they were trying to begin with. I've never seen documented evidence of the Nazis making physical landing on Antarctica.
Neither have I.
Their favorite trick was to overfly. They would drop these streamers with a large weight with the Nazi swastika on it and inscribed, claiming this land, claiming this territory in the name of Heil Hitler and the Fuhrer and the Third Reich. And these things were dropped by airplane over there, and they would claim that turf was theirs by doing so.
And that's where the embellishment probably came from.
I do have a very funny story sometime to talk about the whole Germans down there. This did come up one year that I was there, but it's not anything of scientific. It's all jokey stuff, but it was an absolute freaking riot when this thing started up because one of the people that were involved was the nephew of a very famous movie director. He was a lawyer in the Navy, And this guy was an absolute master. I believe he's back in Hollywood doing great things. He was a Navy JAG, and he could cook up schemes. This guy was probably one of the most talented and funny people I've ever been around. He started this whole thing. A German ship came near the coast, and we heard German being spoke on the radio. In Littleton, Christchurch, New Zealand, Hitler's Brain, the movie, was being shown. And that's what he took, those two events, and he started the whole thing up. That the Germans, they were coming. It was like the Russians are coming, but
remember that movie
with Nazis. Yeah. It was unbelievable. This guy, and he could deadpan his face, and he would tell you stuff, and you just wanted to believe him because of the way he talked about it. Obviously, that's great if you're a lawyer, you know.
He should be on this show.
One of the questions I want to ask everybody in there is, I want to get one thing. I want to show this picture. Maybe you guys have an idea what this is. This is the Glock, but it has these symbols at the bottom that they supposedly were occult symbols or some kind of mystery symbols that were there. Now, taking a look at that, we want to go, and I want to get this other symbol here.
I was going to mention Kecksburg a little earlier.
Yep. I was going to mention Kecksburg. That's what we're going to talk about now. It's Kecksburg. Is that
There
right
it is.
there? So, Kecksburg, do you think this was us developing Nazi technology from the Glock, or was this our technology that possibly something like Cash Landrum case? And let me start with Mark. What do you think?
My personal opinion is that from what I've read about Kecksburg and saw about Kecksburg, it actually seems to be a Soviet satellite component that crashed and was, of course, immediately cordoned off because it's Soviet stuff on our territory.
Sure.
Now, keep in mind that that kind of thing happens fairly often. In our observatory out in the Sonoran Desert, I just recently caught a Chinese rocket re-entering the atmosphere on our all-sky cam, and I've got it. You can see it re-entering the atmosphere right over the observatory in Arizona, okay, heading down from like Nevada and down toward Mexico, and it's going right over the observatory. So this kind of stuff happens fairly often, and these satellite falls are something that is, can't be ignored. So could it be a satellite? I would say, if you are looking at a situation, it's Occam's razor. What is the simplest explanation or the most likely explanation? That may very well be what you're seeing. I don't necessarily think that that's always what you're seeing at all. So I gave Kecksburg a chance, and has yet to show me that it's anything but potentially a Soviet satellite or a chunk of rocket tank that made it to the Earth.
Don, what do you think?
Okay, Kecksburg. I was. It happened in December, if I am remembering correctly, of 1966. Kecksburg, huh?
I believe that's correct.
Yeah, Kecksburg is approximately 100 miles, give or take, from my hometown, and I remember the night that it happened. Okay, we heard about it on the radio. Now, everybody initially, it was a UFO. But if you recall, we had signed a treaty with the Soviet Union that if any of their space stuff came down, we would immediately turn it back over to them, and vice versa, right? Well, we didn't. Now, I know Stan Gordon. He lives over that way. Stan has researched that inside, outside, upside down. And, from what I know and what he told me, okay, almost immediately, I believe it was the Air Force, hit the scene. They got a big flatbed truck. They managed to get this thing on the flatbed truck. They covered it up. They drove it out of there. Now, I think it was Soviet. I think it was a Soviet device of some kind. And I don't think we gave it back to them. Okay. I think our people wanted to see what the heck they were up to, and they absconded with it. And that's why all the secrecy ever since. But in Kecksburg itself, there's still, you want to cause a community row and a fight, okay? Those people are broken down into camps. Not so much anymore. I mean, my God, it's been well over 50 years now. But they've almost 60 years. They've been squabbling about whatever that was for a long time. I personally think, Chris, that it was a Russian satellite or something that came down.
How did the idea of these occult symbols then on Kecksburg there? Is that just fantasy? People making that up?
Well, it could be Russian writing.
Cyrillic writing, yeah.
Cyrillic. It could have been Cyrillic, yeah.
Cyrillic,
yeah. As Don says, in some of the componentry when it was first found, and so we are not familiar with how they write, and their letters are different than ours. If you look at how Moscow in Russian looks like it's spelled Moskva. Okay, it's like so it's like different writing, different approaches. So it could easily be mistaken as some kind of otherworldly language or occultish, and all it takes is one person to say, "I think those are occult letters." Oh, that's the most interesting thing. That'll get legs more than it's Cyrillic writing, So that'll get legs faster. So I just that's my opinion on it.
It's a good opinion, Commander. What do you think? Kecksburg.
I agree with Don and Mark. Here's my added feature. Stan and I have spoken at length about this one. I've been out to the site. In fact, there was a KGRA picture of me out there in front of the model there. One interesting aspect that I like to throw into play here is, and I think the explanation of the markings on the outside of it being Cyrillic, there are tendencies sometimes when you copy something to copy it exactly. And the Soviets did this. They recovered the intake from an F-4. And that intake allowed the F-4 to fly supersonic, nearly high, deep, approaching Mach 2. And when they recovered this piece from a crashed F-4 in Vietnam, when they reproduced it, when they replicated it exactly because they weren't sure. It has exactly the same number of perforation holes. It even has a little hook on the outside top of it, which was designed to catch the barrier so that it wouldn't go all the way up over on the canopy if you made a barrier landing on the carrier. It had no impact on the supersonic capability. But when they were making that copy, so if you think about them making a copy from something that they had recovered from World War II and the Germans, they may have made it precisely that, and what's interpreted as demonic or the symbology there could be it. Stan and I have talked about this a few times. At first, I scoffed at it. There has been some indication that they think the way the flight path, and the reason that they knew how quick to react to it is, by the 60s, we had a pretty good idea when something was coming out of orbit. And nowadays, you can predict very, very accurately where it's going to come down.
And where you're going to put it.
Not so much. But you had an area that was going to come down. They said the flight path of this looked like somebody actually was inside it making some flight inputs. I don't see anything on that vehicle that would allow that to happen, but I don't know. But there is talk at Kecksburg that there was an occupant in that spacecraft.
I had never heard that.
Well, actually, you see, that kind of can be sensible, because consider how the Soviets.
Well, there's a dip, Mark. There's a curve that it's coming down, and then it looks like somebody does something to extend out the arc at the end of it.
Well, if you think about it, isn't it possible that a manned craft coming down on American soil is going to cause quite a stir?
Sure.
And so the Soyuz has always landed on the steppes. They still do to this day. So they don't have oceans to land in like we do have access to. So they devised a land landing, and it's actually quite clever. And the unbelievable technology to make those rockets fire that last impulse just before it hits to soften the cushion landing. It's like landing on a pad of butter.
In this time, though, they weren't using rockets to stop it. What they used was a combination of parachutes and flotation or expansion bags that would do that. In fact, that's what the Starliner, Boeing Starliner, if it ever comes down from the space station, yes. That's how it's going to land. It's going to recover on land. Parachute and then the cushioning bags at the bottom of it. I think it's interesting that Kecksburg, much like the Wakefield monster, which is the thing that crashed in the lake, very, very short distance from where I'm sitting up here in Maine and Wakefield, New Hampshire. Mm-hmm. And it appears that was a small Soviet satellite. Its reactor battery, its nuke capability was compromised. It melted the ice on the water. An old oak tree died. The dog that was playing in the water died afterwards. The ice would not reform. That little pond stayed hot. And immediately people showed up very, very quickly. That was in 1978. And I remember that one because it came on the news because there was a lot of stuff going on. And that one is a great one to study because there's the Men in Black routine. There is the ass clown man in black that showed up who was asking questions, dressed very, very strangely, took out a business card. All these business cards fell on the ground. They were all different names and different jobs this guy was presenting. It's just crazy stuff that went on. But the recovery was very quick, like Kecksburg.
You mean Richard Doty?
Okay, so I'd like to ask, before we wrap up the show, because we only got like 2 or 3 minutes left, I want to go around round table and just ask this one question. I'll start with Don. Don, the Germans or us, anti-gravity, have we developed it?
I think we have. I think it's a super black program, and it's conceivable. And I'm not just saying this on my own. I think it's conceivable. We may currently have craft in orbit in space that is utilizing that technology.
So you think we have a secret space program?
I certainly do, yes.
And tell me why you believe that.
Well, some of the people I've talked to, okay, and some of them have been fairly highly placed. And this is something that I've always made a habit of asking these people when I've met them about a secret space program. Then we have the peripheral evidence. How many times have you been looking at the feed from the ISS? Something moves into the screen and suddenly everything goes black. Boom.
True.
Okay. I think they're up there. They're flying, and they're trying desperately to keep it under total wrap.
Right, Commander.
Anti-gravity. Yes, I think we have anti-gravity. I think it's prohibitively expensive and probably dangerous, and I think it's extremely disruptive to the world economy. That we don't want to jump to it. I think that we're pretty far down the line on it. It's I guess we're waiting for some great moment to have that next breakthrough, whatever it's going to come up. Before we go, I want to thank everyone in the chat room that I was reading. Kathleen, Raph, Fred, thank you very much for joining us tonight in the show. God's peace, surpassing all knowledge and understanding. My wish to all of you. Mac Maloney's UFOs in Wartime, What They Don't Want You to Know. Great book for an earlier subject that we had. Max did an incredibly good study on all the events basically from about the Civil War up with UFO.
All right, real quick, Mark.
I don't believe that we've gotten there yet. To be fair, I understand there's lots of potential, but I think it's just we're not there yet. Basically, for all the reasons I talked about earlier, with we need a fusion reactor basically to make those particles I was telling you about. So we're not. I don't think we're there yet.
All right, folks, this is our show. Thank you for being with us, and say goodnight and stay safe for UAP Crossfire.
And please drop us an email, and we'll tell you where Chris and I shop to get these incredibly good-looking shirts.
Yeah, I got one too.
Happy birthday, Don. Happy birthday.
Happy birthday, Don.
Thank you.
I'll wear my shirt. I'll wear my shirt. I promise it next week.